"This guy thinks he knows the law?" Lieutenant Rawlins snarled as he slammed the black man's head onto the car hood in full view of a crowd live streaming the scene. What he didn't know was that the man he had just handcuffed was a newly appointed federal judge, a Harvard valedictorian whose thesis was on human rights. 3 months later, Rawlins walked into the courtroom and saw a familiar face. "What state do you live in? If that scene unfolded before your eyes, would you stay silent or speak up?" The sun scorched the parking lot like it had something to prove. Heat shimmered off the blacktop in wavering waves, and the air smelled faintly of rubber and dust. Isaiah's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he pulled into the faded lines of a corner space. He wasn't running, he wasn't hiding, and he sure as hell wasn't breaking the law. He'd just picked up groceries. A bag of lettuce, some eggs, and a loaf of bread sat on the passenger seat. No rush, no reason to be afraid, but the siren still hit like a gut punch. Short, sharp, unnecessary. 2 cop cruisers flanked his car like vultures. Doors swung open, and out stepped Brent and Rick like they were born for this. One with a sneer, the other with a predator's calm. Brent tapped Isaiah's window with the back of his knuckle, slow and condescending. No introduction, no badge, just that dead tone of voice that dripped with entitlement. "License and registration," he said. Isaiah reached for the glove box, but the second his hand moved, Rick slapped the glass with a black baton and shouted, "Don't move unless I say." Isaiah froze, both hands back on the wheel, eyes steady. "Sir, I'm just—" But Rick was already walking around, muttering, "One of those fucking types." Brent leaned in closer, scanning Isaiah like a threat on legs. "What's in the trunk?" he asked. Isaiah blinked. "Nothing but groceries." Brent shook his head. "Pop it open, now." Isaiah hesitated, not out of defiance, but confusion. There was no cause, no reason. But Rick wasn't waiting. He slammed the baton into the hood hard, making the entire car jolt. "You don't need to know the law," he snapped. "You just need to know when to bow your damn head." Isaiah didn't argue. He didn't protest. He didn't even flinch when Brent yanked open the door and ordered him out like a misbehaving dog. He stepped out, silent, calm, but the calm only pissed them off more. Brent grabbed his shirt collar and shoved him onto the hood. Metal blistering hot from the afternoon sun seared through the thin cotton of Isaiah's shirt, branding heat across his chest. His cheek slammed against steel. He tasted rust. Rick grabbed his wrist and twisted it behind his back, not to cuff him but to punish the stillness, the compliance. Then came the spit, warm, wet, personal. It hit between his shoulder blades, sliding like filth down his spine. Brent's boot came down next, heel to wrist, bone to steel, grinding like he was trying to crack stone. Isaiah grunted, but he didn't scream, didn't shout, just bit down on the pain like it was something he'd been forced to taste before. "You think staying quiet makes you clean?" Rick sneered, leaning so close Isaiah could smell his breath, cigarettes and bile. "You think not fighting back means you're different?" Brent chuckled, mean and bored. "This one's too quiet. Makes me think he's hiding something." They laughed like they were sharing an inside joke. Brent dug a knee into Isaiah's back while Rick tossed the groceries across the pavement. Eggs cracking, bread smashed, lettuce torn like it had done something wrong. No search warrant, no reason, just raw, unchecked authority. Isaiah kept his eyes on the blur of asphalt inches from his face, breathing slowly and shallowly. He didn't look at them. He didn't ask why. That would only invite worse. Rick stood back and spat to the side. Another day, another asshole who thinks his skin gets him a pass. Brent finally lifted his knee. "Let's see some ID." Isaiah opened his mouth to speak. He'd left it in the glove box, but Rick beat him to it. "Wait, is this your wallet?" he asked, plucking it from the floor of the car. Isaiah barely had time to nod before Rick smirked and tossed it, underhanded, toward the nearest storm drain. It hit the curb, bounced once, and slid out of sight. Isaiah blinked. Brent smiled. Oops, no apologies, no concern, just power on the full display. They pulled him upright, half dragging, half shoving him toward the cruiser. Isaiah didn't resist. His shoulder throbbed, wrist numb, skin blistering from the hood. Behind him, the groceries wilted in the sun, a cracked egg leaking into the pavement like spilled truth. Brent pushed him into the back seat, slammed the door, and turned to Rick. "Fucker didn't even raise his voice," he muttered. Rick lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly. "Yeah, makes it easier to write him up as non-compliant. You know the drill." Inside the cruiser, Isaiah sat like a ghost, sweat running into the corner of his eye. No air, no water, no charges read, no rights recited. He watched the city blur by through tinted glass, hands still trembling from the pressure. He wasn't scared, not exactly, just hollow, like something vital had been scooped out and discarded beside the lettuce. At the precinct, no one asked him a question. No one offered a reason. Rick filed the report with a red slash across the top. Repeat offender, threatening demeanor. Brent made a joke about cleaning up the streets loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. Isaiah was led into a holding cell, no phone call, no food, no timeline. 8 hours passed like they were dragged through molasses. The light overhead flickered constantly, like it too was too tired to burn steadily. Isaiah sat on the cold metal bench, back straight, jaw clenched, his silence a shield. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He stared straight ahead, eyes tracing the cracks in the paint like they held secrets. When they finally opened the door, it wasn't with ceremony or explanation. Brent leaned against the frame and nodded toward the exit. "You're free to go," he said, like it was some kind of gift. Isaiah walked out without a word, body aching, mouth dry, clothes soaked through with sweat and spit and shame. He stopped at the front desk. "Can I get a copy of the report?" he asked. Brent looked at him, eyes like polished stone. "No report," he said. "You were never here." Then, with a grin that didn't reach his eyes, he added, "You kept quiet. That's good. Stay that way." Isaiah didn't answer. He turned, pushed through the heavy door, and stepped into the dying light of evening. The street outside looked the same. Cars moved, people walked, somewhere a dog barked, but Isaiah stood still, shoulders squared, gaze sharp, not defeated, not yet, just redefined, because they thought silence meant submission. They thought stillness meant submission. But Isaiah knew something else, something they hadn't bothered to consider. A man doesn't scream when he's measuring the weight of what comes next. He doesn't fight when he's memorizing every detail for later. And he doesn't forget, not the voice, not the heat of the hood, not the taste of metal in his mouth. He remembers, he builds, he waits, and one day he answers. He didn't slam the door as he left the precinct. He didn't look back. He didn't breathe too deeply or walk too fast. Isaiah simply stepped out of the building like a man re-entering a world that hadn't noticed he'd disappeared. The light outside had shifted, settling into that gray hour between day and dusk, where everything seemed quieter, more distant. His shirt stuck to his back. His wrist throbbed where the boot had pressed bone against heat. But he said nothing, because silence had become his most loaded weapon. Inside the station, the echo of his departure barely stirred the air. Brent leaned over the intake desk, twirling a pen with the kind of casual cruelty that didn't need volume to be heard. Rick stood beside him, arms crossed, chewing on the inside of his cheek like it was a habit born from boredom, not guilt. The wallet, the ID, the shredded illusion of legal protection, all of it had disappeared down a storm drain with deliberate, practiced ease. Paperwork came next, and Brent handled it like he always did, with a smirk half buried beneath procedure. He wrote threatening demeanor in slanted print that looked far too neat for the lie it carried. He drew a thick red circle around prior incidents, even though there were none, then stamped repeat concern over Isaiah's name like it had always belonged there. That's what the system allowed. No questions, no proof, just ink and implication. No need for bruises when bureaucracy could do the bleeding for them. In the back hallway, a flickering light bulb buzzed above the holding cells. Isaiah sat alone on a steel bench. No charges, no phone call, no voice raised in protest. He hadn't asked about his wallet. He hadn't argued about the false report. And that, more than anything, unnerved them. Because silence wasn't surrender. Not the kind Isaiah wielded. It was a silence sharpened by control, measured by time, honed by the absence of panic. That kind of stillness doesn't crack. It waits. Hours passed like cement. The air inside the cell was too thick to breathe and too stale to taste. No one brought him water. No one asked if he needed anything. Rick had made sure of that. "Let him stew," he'd muttered, dropping the clipboard off at dispatch. "Maybe next time he'll remember what happens when you give attitude." Brent hadn't replied. He didn't need to. He'd made his point on the hood of the car. Isaiah sat unmoving, eyes fixed on the wall in front of him. It was peeling in one corner, the paint split like old skin, revealing a darker layer beneath. That spot became his anchor, his fixed point. He didn't count the hours and minutes. He counted them in heartbeats, in blinks, in the subtle ache that spread from his wrist to his elbow. Still, he didn't ask to be let out. He didn't shout through the bar. He didn't pound the door or demand to speak to someone. That wasn't how this system worked. You didn't win here by making noise, not when the walls themselves were trained to ignore it. At the front desk, the evening shift had taken over. A tired officer thumbed through forms without looking up. Brant sauntered over, rolled his neck, and cracked his knuckles. "That guy in 4, he said, pointing toward Isaiah's cell with a nod. "He's clean, technically. No charges sticking." The officer frowned. "So, cut him loose?" Brant shrugged. "Eventually, let him cool off a little longer." Then he leaned closer and added, under his breath, "Impression's what matters. Paperwork's just a formality." 8 hours. That's how long Isaiah remained in that cell. 8 hours, with nothing but the hum of electricity, the creak of metal, and the weight of eyes that had stopped seeing him the second they labeled him. When the door finally opened, it wasn't ceremony that greeted him, it was disinterest. A young officer stepped aside without speaking, gesturing with a slight jerk of his chin. Isaiah stood, stretched slowly, and walked past without acknowledgement. No one returned his wallet. No one mentioned the groceries. No apology, no charge, just a hollow void of responsibility that echoed louder than any siren. At the exit, Brent waited, arms folded across his chest like a man guarding a secret he knew would never be told. He didn't smile. He didn't apologize. He just stared. And then, as Isaiah passed him, he said it, low and sharp, "You kept your mouth shut. That's good. Keep it that way." The words landed like stones in Isaiah's chest, not because they hurt, but because they confirmed everything he'd already known. That silence was expected. That quiet was compliance. That to be still was to be invisible. But Isaiah's silence was not a gift. It was a ledger, a record, a promise kept under breath and behind teeth. Outside, the night had fully arrived. The air was cooler, but not refreshing. It carried the weight of the day like smoke clinging to clothes. Isaiah walked with deliberate steps, back straight, face unreadable. He had no phone to call anyone, no ID to show anyone, no receipt to prove anything had ever happened, and still he felt more documented than ever, not in files or databases, but in memory, in the heat that still lingered on his skin, in the imprint of Brent's knee, in the echo of Rick's laugh. He didn't go home right away. He walked, not aimlessly, not without purpose, but with the pace of a man refusing to be erased. The city had returned to normal around him, cars rushing by, conversations drifting out of lit windows, people laughing, as if justice had always been the norm. And perhaps for them it had been. But Isaiah walked through a different version of the city, one where systems didn't malfunction. They functioned exactly as intended, one where silence was the only safe language, one where every step forward was taken on cracked pavement made from broken rules. Somewhere down the road, he stopped, not to rest, not to cry, but to breathe. One long, even breath, then another, until the night no longer felt like a weight, but a witness. He closed his eyes, just for a moment, and let the silence speak back to him. It didn't promise revenge. It didn't offer redemption. It simply reminded him that the system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly the way those like Brent and Rick wanted it to. And if that was true, then silence, the kind he'd chosen, wasn't just survival. It was the strategy. He walked until the night had no more streets to offer him. By the time Isaiah reached his apartment, the city had already begun shedding its shadows. The hallway was quiet, the lights overhead humming faintly, and when he closed the door behind him, it made no sound. There was no one waiting, no voice to ask what had happened, no one to tell. He placed his keys on the counter, though he no longer had a wallet to put beside them, and sat down without turning on the light. The silence inside was different now, not suffocating, not empty, but calibrated, like a held breath before a decision. It didn't start with some grand speech or noble epiphany. It began with a question he didn't speak out loud. What would change if I just disappeared? The truth sat heavy in the air. Nothing. The system that swallowed people like him wouldn't miss a single bone. And that was the moment the answer formed, not as a scream, but as a direction. He wasn't going to disappear. He was going to be seen, not through protest, not through pain, but through precision. The law had always felt like an enemy, cold, manipulative, twisted by those who wore it like armor and wielded it like a blade. But that night, Isaiah stared at his bruised wrist, then looked over at the dusty bookshelf by the window. One volume stood out, a thick, unopened book on constitutional law he'd bought years ago and never touched. He pulled it down, not out of inspiration, but it was time to stop surviving by silence and start surviving by skill. He got a job working nights at a freight yard, unloading shipments under flickering lights, with calloused hands. It wasn't clean work, it wasn't fair pay, but it was quiet, and it left his days open. During the early hours of each morning after clocking out, he took the subway to the city library and sat in the same back corner, day after day, reading case law, judicial opinions, procedural codes. At first, it was overwhelming, dry, complex, designed to exclude. But Isaiah didn't flinch. He studied the system not with awe but with surgical focus. He dissected it like a crime scene, understanding where power lived and how it traveled through paper, through precedent, through passive signatures that determined someone's worth. He sold everything that wasn't essential: his television, old jackets, even a ring that had belonged to his father. Bit by bit, he scraped together enough to register for a community legal prep course. He was the oldest in the room by at least 15 years, but he didn't care. He didn't need approval. He needed information, facts, language, leverage. And as the months passed, he began to change, not in spirit, but in structure. His silence sharpened, his posture shifted. He no longer walked like a man looking to avoid trouble. He walked like a man memorizing the walls of the fortress he would one day burn from the inside out. But progress, even when honest, doesn't erase the stain they place on you. When Isaiah applied for financial aid to continue his legal studies, he submitted everything. Every form, every letter, every transcript. His GPA was perfect, his recommendations solid, but the rejection came back faster than expected. A thin envelope, one paragraph, and at the bottom, in handwriting that didn't match the printed text, a sentence that didn't even pretend to hide its bias. History of police conflict, considered a reputational risk. That was all. No hearing, no appeal, no room to explain. His detainment, unfiled, uncharged, undocumented, still managed to shadow him like a guilty verdict. He sat alone in the stairwell of his building that night, the rejection letter folded neatly in his palm. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, but they no longer sounded like alarms. They sounded like echoes of something expected, constant, systemic. He didn't shred the letter. He didn't throw it away. He opened the worn black notebook he carried with him, turned to a blank page and wrote the date in the top right corner. Beneath it, in clean, steady print, he wrote just one sentence. "We don't win by shouting. We win by knowing the rules better than the ones who write them." The page stayed open on his lap for hours, not because he didn't know what came next, but because that sentence was no longer a thought. It was a vow. From that day forward, every morning began with study. Every night ended with labor. He lived on black coffee and determination. He stopped waiting for systems to hand him justice and instead began designing how he would take it piece by piece. Not by violence, not by noise, but by entering the very courtroom where he had once been dragged through the side door and never announced. He kept the notebook with him at all times, filling its pages with notes, cases, names, not just legal facts, but memories, details that might have faded if he didn't trap them in ink. The brand of boots Brent wore, the brand of gum Rick chewed, the exact words etched into the precinct sign above the door. These weren't just moments. They were materials, the bricks he'd use to build his version of justice, a version they couldn't erase with spit or stamps or the flick of a pen. Every rejection became fuel, every barrier a blueprint. When applications were denied, he found another program. When people asked why someone his age was chasing a degree, he told them nothing, because explanations were for the comfortable. Isaiah didn't need to be understood. He needed to be unignorable. There were days when the weight of it nearly broke him, when exhaustion dragged behind him like an anchor, when the sting of his past caught him off guard and wrapped around his throat like a noose. But even then, even on the hardest days, he did not fold. He had folded once, on the hood of a police car, beneath the weight of a knee and a boot and the silence of institutional indifference, and that had been enough for a lifetime. Now, every class he passed, every book he finished, every footstep toward that courtroom was a stone laid on the path back to that single moment when his face had been pressed into metal and spit had soaked into his shirt. He would return, not as a victim, but as a verdict. And history, though it had refused to record his pain, would have no choice but to record his rise. The news broke like a sour wind. 2 officers accused of excessive force against a black teenager in a routine stop. No weapons, no threats, no resisting arrest, just a body bruised, a breath stolen, a name forgotten. The clip circulated fast, shaky camera work, the kind that screamed witness without protection. And then it came, that frame, frozen mid-matter, with Rick's boot planted square in the boy's back, pinning him to the pavement like a threat that had to be crushed before it dared to rise. The audio was even worse. Brent's voice cut through the static with casual venom, as if repeating a well-worn joke. Resisting? That kind of thing resists just by existing. Isaiah didn't flinch. He played the video once, then again, each time slower. Not to hear the words, not to watch the violence, but to catch something else. A signal buried beneath the rage. And there it was. Brant's left hand, raised mid-sentence, gesturing with the same 3-finger curl, the same lazy flick that had preceded a blow 10 years ago. It wasn't a motion, it was a mark, a personal signature in a language only survivors remembered. Isaiah leaned forward, eyes narrowing, as if the screen might bleed. That motion had been seared into his memory long before cameras started rolling. Back then, there'd been no footage, just sweat, spit, and silence. Now, there was proof, not of guilt, but of pattern. Not a smoking gun, but a mirror. The same men, the same sin. He said nothing to anyone. No declarations, no outrage. He simply made a call, requested the case file, and submitted his intention to represent. When the clerk asked for clarification, Isaiah gave none. He didn't need to. His name alone did the work now. The weight of a man who no longer had to explain himself. The system, still crooked, had no choice but to let him walk in through the front. He read the victim's statement without blinking. The boy's name was Jalen, 17, honor student, no record, the kind of profile the press loved to prop up as proof of tragedy, as if being human required qualification. But Isaiah wasn't interested in Jalen's innocence. He was interested in Jalen's innocence. He was interested in Brent and Rick's consistency. Because the footage didn't show an anomaly, it showed a method. The kind of violence you don't invent in a moment of fear. The kind you refine over time. The kind that gets mistaken for routine. Rick hadn't changed. The same arrogant stance. The same twitch in his jaw that betrayed how much he enjoyed the performance. And Brent, still carrying that same slow drawl, that same veneer of authority sharpened into threat. The years had given him gray at the temples, a few deeper lines around the mouth, but none of it softened him. If anything, time had only sanded away the parts of him that pretended. Isaiah saw it now. Not rage, not impulse, but culture, a practice, a repetition. The video wasn't evidence to him. It wasn't even a weapon. It was a memory, reanimated. The camera had finally captured what memory had never stopped playing, a choreography of control, of humiliation. Isaiah didn't press play again. He didn't need to. The scene was no longer on the screen. It was back inside him, alive, awake, and demanding precision. He drafted his acceptance of the case with a pen that didn't shake. Every letter was carved like it was sealing something. He didn't include a statement of motive. That wasn't necessary. Not now. Motivation didn't belong in declarations. It belonged in execution. And Isaiah was no longer a man fueled by revenge. He was a man driven by repetition. What had been done once had been done again. That was all the reason he needed. The city didn't ask why he wanted the case. The courts didn't question it. They were just glad someone with stature was willing to clean up the mess. The media whispered, half curious, half cautious. They didn't know the connection. Not yet. Isaiah offered them nothing. No interviews, no comment. Silence had always been his shield. Now it was his sword. As he prepared, he didn't look for new wounds to exploit. He didn't need to. Everything he needed had already been recorded, not just by the video, but by history. His history. Brent's hand signal, Rick's body language, the casualness of the brutality. These weren't errors. They were echoes. Isaiah wasn't hunting justice. He was responding to a pattern, as methodically as they had executed it. And that's what made it terrifying. This wasn't a coincidence. This was designed. He didn't sleep much in the days leading up to the first court hearing, not because of fear, but because of calculation. Every word had to be precise. Every look had to carry weight. Every pause had to be loaded with enough silence to make the walls tremble. Not to provoke, not to punish, but to remind. Because what he was about to do wasn't a confrontation. It was a reflection. He would hold the system up to itself, and he would not blink. He met Jalen's family briefly before proceedings began. A quiet room, a quiet mother, a boy too bruised to speak without flinching. Isaiah offered no promises. He offered no comfort. He just told them one thing. "I've seen them before." The mother nodded like she already knew. Like every black parent in the city had memorized the names of danger, the way others memorized school schedules. The day of the first hearing, Isaiah stood in front of the courthouse steps, alone, dressed in silence as much as in his suit. He carried no folders. He brought no entourage. Just that same black notebook, worn and steady. As he crossed the threshold, his steps didn't echo. They landed, measured, heavy, like a countdown. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about vindication. This was about rhythm, about identifying the beat of brutality and interrupting it mid-note. Brent and Rick had counted on time to protect them. They'd relied on the system's deafness. But Isaiah had been listening all along, not with his ears, with his memory. And now, memory had a name, a courtroom, a docket, and it was asking for blood in the language of the law. The courtroom air didn't stir. It waited, as if the walls themselves had learned to hold their breath. And when Isaiah stepped into that space, robed in black, spine straight, gait measured, the silence didn't break. It deepened. Every step he took was deliberate, a footfall carved out of history. There was no tremor in his hands, no hesitation in his posture. Only gravity, only focus. Only the weight of years compresses into this exact moment. He ascended the bench, placed his black notebook beside the gavel, and looked ahead without blinking. The robe wasn't armor. It was a memory. Brent sat in the defendant's row, legs slightly spread, chin up with that unmistakable arrogance of someone still convinced the world bent to his uniform. Rick, just beside him, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed like he'd been dragged to a joke he didn't find funny. Their suits were crisp, their expressions loose, but the tension around their mouths betrayed what their bodies wouldn't admit. They were watching. Not alert, not yet, but curious. Brent nudged Rick with his elbow, his smirk too casual to be innocent. "Hey, you recognize this guy?" Rick turned slowly, sizing Isaiah up the way he had 1,000 men before, with that slick blend of dismissiveness and threat, the kind of look that measured worth and usefulness. His lip curled, half amused, half bored. "Probably one of those we booked years back. You know, they start wearing ties, think they're someone." Brent chuckled. "Yeah, same dead look in the eye, though." They both laughed. Low, private, poisonous. Isaiah didn't move. He didn't look at them. He didn't raise a brow or shift his weight. He just reached for the gavel, tapped it once against the wood, firm, final, and began the session. That single strike didn't echo. It lingered. It settled into the room like judgment that had waited a decade to take shape. In his hand was a file. No trembling, no rustling, just clean movement. pages opening to reveal bold letters in red, "Officer, Misconduct, Keller and Daly." There was no announcement, no dramatic pause, no unraveling of identity. Isaiah made no effort to draw attention to himself. He didn't need to. His presence was not a performance. It was a fact, a recalibration of the hierarchy. And yet, the pressure in the room shifted. Something unspoken passed between the wood of the bench and the steel in Brent's spine. Rick tapped his fingers against his thigh once, twice, then stopped. Isaiah's gaze moved finally to the defense table. Not a glance, a placement. His eyes held, unflinching, unreadable. He looked through them, not at them, past their clothes, past their title, past the mask of their rehearsed innocence. It wasn't recognition, it was cataloging. And for a moment, just a flicker, Brent's throat shifted in a swallow too dry. The prosecuting attorney spoke first, breaking the quiet with procedural monotony, reading out the names, the date, the facts already known. But Isaiah wasn't listening to the words. He didn't need to. He was measuring the rhythm of the room, the discomfort in Brent's shifting posture, the small twitch in Rick's jaw every time the phrase excessive force was spoken. This wasn't about proving guilt. That came later. This was about setting the temperature, and Isaiah's silence made the room cold. There was no point in speaking to confirm what was already documented. The video existed, the reports were filed, but Isaiah knew the real weight wasn't in what was seen. It was in what was remembered. He stared straight ahead as the facts were recited, yet his mind didn't rest on the teenager who'd been brutalized. It drifted, not back in time, but down, to the scorched metal of a hood under his cheek, the burn across his collarbone, the sound of a boot heel scraping pavement, that same curl of Brent's fingers before the strike. It wasn't déjà vu. It was documentation, repeated, reinforced. Rick whispered something to his lawyer and gave a brief, humorless smile. Brent's confidence didn't fade, not yet, but he shifted in his seat like something beneath the surface was beginning to slip. Isaiah kept his hands folded over the file, unmoved. He hadn't entered this courtroom as a ghost from their past. He had entered as their reckoning, not with theatrics, but with presence. That was what men like Brent feared most. Not the scream, but the stare. Not the accusation, but the authority that didn't need to explain itself. Outside the walls, the city moved on, unaware. But inside, the rhythm had shifted. The court stenographer typed more slowly. The attorney's tones flattened. Something intangible but unrelenting had settled in the air. The kind of pressure that made even breathing feel like a declaration. Isaiah still hadn't spoken directly to either of them. He didn't need to. His restraint was a noose. Every second of calm, another inch of rope. Brent's attorney objected to a piece of video evidence on procedural grounds. Rick snorted under his breath. That's what they always do, hide behind tape. Brent leaned closer, muttering, "This guy's just trying to look important. He doesn't remember us." Isaiah finally turned a page in his file. The sound was subtle, but it sliced clean through the defense's bravado. He didn't raise his eyes. He didn't answer. He just moved, as if justice, when real, never had to rush. The defense glanced over at him again, and for the first time, Brent didn't smile. Rick shifted in his seat. A whisper passed between them. Too quiet for the room, but not quiet enough to hide the doubt. Isaiah let the silence stretch, not as a stall, but as a strategy. Every second without confrontation was a reminder. The trap had already been set. They just hadn't felt the snap yet. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't a speech. It was a ruling. Crisp, direct, clipped by control. This court recognizes the submission of video evidence dated July 12th. Let it be entered as part of the initial record. No emotion, no emphasis, just clarity. A voice that knew the ground beneath it couldn't be moved. Brent's fingers twitched, Rick's mouth parted, closed, then locked. They were beginning to see it, not who he was, but what he had become. Isaiah didn't give them more, not yet. He didn't deliver monologues. He didn't make them look at him, because this wasn't about seeing. It was about remembering. And remembrance was a slow burn, the kind that starts behind the ribs, tightens in the lungs, then explodes only when it's too late to brace. For now, Isaiah just held the gavel, like memory carved into wood. He didn't need to say it aloud, but the walls knew, the air knew, and slowly, so did Brent and Rick. They were no longer in control of the courtroom. They were in it, and the man behind the bench hadn't forgotten a single thing. The courtroom held its breath. The silence wasn't just a pause, it was a weapon, and Isaiah wielded it like a seasoned marksman, letting every second drag the defendants deeper into their discomfort. The air grew heavier, not from volume, but from anticipation, that slow, creeping dread that builds when those who have spent their lives dictating consequence suddenly realize they're no longer behind the trigger. Brent finally broke, not with fear but with calculation, the same kind he had always relied on. He sat upright, squared his shoulders, and adjusted his tie like the truth was something he could charm into silence. When he stood, he didn't look at Isaiah. He looked past him, beyond the robe, the bench, the walls. He looked to where power used to sit, at the back of every courtroom, folded in assumption. "Your Honor," he began, voice smooth but sharp, "we acted within the necessary bounds. The situation required immediate physical control. It was a response based on perceived threat, standard protocol in high-tension environments." He paused, giving the words a chance to hang in the room like absolution. They didn't. They landed with a thud, dry, predictable, recycled from 1,000 other defenses that had kept men like him protected and clean. He wasn't pleading, he was justifying. There was no remorse in his tone, just strategy. Rick didn't stand. He leaned forward, arms resting on the table, voice low but clear, soaked in disdain. "If following procedure still gets you hauled into court, then maybe no one should want this job. Maybe next time, when a situation gets ugly, officers will just stand back, let someone get hurt, and say it wasn't their business." He smirked, not because he thought it was funny, but because it was his reflex. Hide behind bitterness, mask it as realism, spit it out like gospel. "You punish us for doing the hard work. Who's left to do it?" The gallery shifted, a quiet rustle. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else crossed their arms. Rick leaned back like he'd just dropped the closing argument of a man tired of being misunderstood. Brent nodded, ever so slightly, as if that single gesture could anchor their crumbling credibility. Isaiah didn't blink. He didn't look at the attorneys. He didn't acknowledge the posturing. He just sat, motionless, intact, gaze heavy as gravity. And then he spoke, not loud, not fast, but with a cold clarity that didn't need to rise to command attention. "If the boundaries of your duty are only visible when someone's watching," he said, "then you were never protecting anything, only yourselves." The silence snapped. His voice didn't accuse, it defined. It didn't echo, it struck. Brent's jaw twitched, a small ripple of something defensive flickering behind his eyes. Rick tilted his head, trying to mask the tightening in his mouth with another smirk, but the edges had dulled. Isaiah leaned forward, not physically, but with weight. The weight of law, the weight of memory, the weight of every time he had been told to stay quiet and survive. "You say you acted within protocol," he continued, "yet the outcome required a hospital bed and an internal investigation. You say you're victims of over-scrutiny, but the only reason we're having this conversation is because someone happened to film you. No flourish, no emotion, just a dismantling, brick by brick, until all that remained was the hollow defense of men who had never truly been questioned, until now." Isaiah paused, letting the silence settle back into the floorboards. Then he said it, not a lecture, not a threat, just a precision-cut warning, delivered in tone like a locked door clicking shut. "If you can't see your limits, I'll help you find them." It wasn't drama. It wasn't a performance. It was law, stripped bare of diplomacy. Rick scoffed, lips parting like he had something clever to say, but nothing came out. Brent glanced at his attorney, but the man didn't move. There was no path forward, not one they could walk through with their usual confidence. Isaiah turned to the stenographer. "Let that be entered into the record." Then back to the defense. "You may proceed with your statements." But the room had already shifted. Something had been recalibrated. subtly but completely. Brent was still upright, still dressed in authority, but the spine behind it had bent. Rick was still posturing, but his smirk came too late and didn't reach his eyes. Their voices, when they returned, came quieter, measured, no longer presiding over the room, merely trying to survive in it. The rest of the session moved forward by procedure. Evidence presented, witnesses listed, timelines established. But the pulse had changed, and Isaiah didn't raise his voice again. He didn't need to. The most powerful men in the room no longer sat at the defense table, and they knew it. The gavel didn't fall at the end of the day. It landed. The gavel hadn't cooled yet when Isaiah ordered the playback. The courtroom didn't stir. It adjusted, like a collective spine straightening before the blade dropped. No explanation, no lead-in, just a crisp directive from the bench. Play the full body cam footage, all segments, no omissions. The clerk hesitated for a breath, then nodded and turned to the technician. A screen flickered to life beside the witness stand. Large, clean, unblinking, the kind of cold clarity Brent and Rick had always counted on avoiding. But this time it was facing them. The opening frames were already familiar. The grainy view of a routine stop, the distorted angle of the officer's vest, Brant's voice, bored, barking, hollowed with urgency, Rick's chuckle, laced with mockery. Then came the maneuver, fast, precise, too practiced to be improvisation. The teenager drops, the world tilts, and everything goes quiet except the scrape of boots and the panting of power. But Isaiah wasn't watching the part everyone had seen. His eyes were on the corner of the screen, the timestamp, the edit, the 10 seconds that had vanished in all public versions, the part that had malfunctioned during the internal review, the lost moment when truth had flinched but not died. Skip to time code 311 and 34 seconds, Isaiah instructed. The room tensed. The defense froze. Brent blinked. Rick shifted in his seat, one finger tapping against the wood grain in uneven rhythm. The screen jumped, filling with color and noise, and then came the silence. The hidden frame. The body on the ground twitched once. Not conscious, not responsive, barely human to the lens anymore. Brant stepped forward, not in panic, not in concern, but with the casual calm of someone stepping on an insect. His boot came down, not to restrain, not to subdue, but to erase. Full weight, heel to skull, a thud, a crack, a final insult. Then Rick's voice, raw and unrehearsed. "Don't move. Don't make me dirty my shoes." It was loud, venomous, spat with the kind of contempt that doesn't come from training, but from entitlement soaked in years of being untouchable. The video cuts back to silence. The body stayed down. The screen went black. No one in the courtroom moved. No one coughed. The sound had been ripped from the air and replaced with something colder. Truth, not the kind you debate, the kind that burns. Isaiah waited 3 full seconds before speaking. His voice, when it came, wasn't louder. It was lower, denser, like weight pressing against the ribs. "You didn't commit this violence because you weren't being watched," he said, eyes locked onto them like steel clamps. "You committed it because you believed no one would ever care to look." Rick stared forward, jaw slack but stubborn. Brent exhaled slowly, no longer masking the tension in his shoulders. He shifted, glanced sideways at the screen, like it had betrayed him, but it hadn't. It had simply remembered what he assumed would be forgotten. Isaiah leaned forward slightly, hands folded with the composure of someone who had waited too long to rush now. "It wasn't the lack of footage that protected you," he continued. "It was the culture of disbelief, the assumption that no one would ask for the missing seconds, that no one would connect the edits, that no one would care." He turned his gaze to the courtroom, not for drama but for proof. But someone did. The words didn't rise, they struck, clean, mathematical, unavoidable. The technician muted the display, but the echo of that stomp, that voice, remained etched into the walls like a scar. Brent's lawyer tried to object. something about inflammatory impact, prejudicial context, but the words didn't land. Isaiah cut through them before they had weight. What's inflammatory is the act, not the evidence. The truth is not a trick. The camera didn't twist your actions, it documented them. Rick opened his mouth as if to speak, to retort, to snarl, but nothing came out, because there was no defense for instinct recorded live, no policy that could cloak laughter over pain, no training that explained why a dying boy was a nuisance to be crushed, not aided. Isaiah sat back, not relaxed, but complete. The room remained still, gripped not by spectacle, but by the unmistakable realization that surveillance had teeth, that documentation had weight, that truth, when caught, could rip away every shield a badge used to mean. They had counted on omission, on lost files, on poor angles, on hesitation. But now, exposed in full color and surround sound, their legacy wasn't authority, it was arrogance. And the screen, still black now, said more in silence than their mouths ever had. The silence left by the video didn't lift, thickened. It clung to the ceiling, pressed into the backs of necks and coiled between the ribs. Brent and Rick sat like statues, chipped at the edges. But it wasn't guilt that tightened their jaws. It was recognition, not of the crime, of the consequence. The footage hadn't just shown what they did, it showed what they always were, and now came the part no training manual could prepare them for. Not the evidence, but the echo. Isaiah adjusted nothing. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't glance at his notes. He simply said, "Call the witness." No name, no preamble, no credentials, just an instruction that landed like a flat line across the room. The gallery murmured faintly, a single pulse of confusion. But Isaiah didn't explain. This wasn't about titles. This was about truth told without introduction. The man who walked in wore a uniform, but not a current one. It fit his frame loosely, like it had once meant something heavier. He didn't strut. He didn't hesitate. He took the stand with the calm detachment of someone who knew too much and had carried it for too long. Isaiah offered him no greeting, just a nod. The oath was administered. He swore in, then silence again. Brent shifted in his seat, something tightening in his temples. Rick leaned forward, eyes narrowing. And then the witness began, slowly, voice even, as if reading from a manual, etched into his bones. "I served 6 years with the department," he said, not looking at anyone. 3 of those were under the command of Officer Keller. No one corrected him. Brent's lawyer didn't move. Rick glanced at Brent, muttered under his breath, "You brought in a cop?" No answer. The man continued, "I was green, eager, and believed in procedure. But on day 1, Keller told me exactly how to get noticed. He said, and I quote, 'You want to move up fast, pick the right targets.' Black kids mostly. They don't file complaints, and even if they do, no one cares." Brent exhaled sharply, like air had just betrayed him. A vein twitched along his neck. "This is ridiculous," he said to his counsel, voice still low. He's twisting it, but his words had no volume. The courtroom had turned into a tuning fork. Every vibration of truth carried sharper than law. The witness didn't pause. It wasn't said in code. It wasn't masked in theory. It was blunt, proud. "We were told to write our reports like stories, shape the ending, shift the blend, and when recruits came in, they got the same speech. Not from whispers, from Keller himself, in the locker room, on the street, like policy." Rick scoffed under his breath, muttering, "So now we're dragging locker talk into a courtroom?" Brent leaned back, face pale but jaw locked. "Why bring this up now?" he asked, more to himself than anyone else. Why now? But the question wasn't meant for answers, because deep down, he knew the system hadn't betrayed him, it had only stopped shielding him. Isaiah remained still. His robe caught no light. His eyes didn't blink. But the pressure behind them bore down on the room like gravity turned up a notch. He said nothing, because silence was no longer absence. It was present. Sharpened. The witness turned slightly, his voice quieter now, not weaker but more intimate, like confession spoken to a wall that remembered. There were days I laughed, days I looked the other way, told myself it wasn't my call. But every time it happened, every time someone like that kid ended up with bruises and no report, every time we edited footage or lost a file, I heard Keller's voice. Not as a memory, as a method. No one spoke. Not the defense, not the prosecution. The courtroom wasn't paralyzed. It was pinned, not by volume, by proximity. The witness wasn't an outsider. He had worn the same badge, followed the same rules. And now his words weren't indictments. They were mirrors, sharp, precise, fatal. Brent looked straight ahead, nostrils flaring. He didn't argue, he didn't deny, he didn't need to. The room already felt the shift. The guilt wasn't being debated, it was being inherited. Rick's voice came next, quiet, bitter, like gravel under breath. This is why no one trusts cops anymore. You give them a badge, they smile, you take it, they start preaching. No one responded, because everyone in the room knew. This wasn't a sermon, it was a leak in the wall, and the flood was coming. Isaiah finally looked up, just once, just long enough to let his eyes rest directly, deliberately, on Brent's. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The weight in that gaze wasn't accusation. It was recognition, like seeing a fire you once survived start burning through someone else's home. Brent held the stare for less than a second before breaking away. The witness stepped down. No applause, no conclusion, no name recorded in the transcript, just the imprint of something irreversible, the voice of someone who once stood beside power, now cutting through it with a truth too old to be fashionable, too raw to be questioned. Isaiah turned back to the docket, let the statement stand as entered. That was all. No emphasis, no summary, but the damage had been done, and it hadn't come from outside. It had come from within. Not every truth needs to be shouted. Some bleed out quietly and still leave a stain no judgment can wash clean. The truth hadn't stopped echoing, but Isaiah knew when to let silence work harder than words. After the unnamed witness stepped down, the room felt cracked, not loud, not broken, but unsettled, like something inside its bones had shifted without permission. Brent kept his eyes fixed forward, fists clenched against his knees, trying to summon the arrogance he used to wear like a badge. Rick leaned into his breath, jaw flexing with every second that passed, hoping his attitude could still shield him from consequence. Isaiah gave them neither attention nor mercy. He didn't need to. Some verdicts arrived before the gavel. Some punishment was layered in memory. He reached down beside the bench and lifted a manila folder with the care of someone holding something heavier than its weight suggested. He didn't open it yet. Instead, he let his fingers rest along the edge, as if deciding whether the next step was worth what it might bring. And then, quietly, he peeled it open and drew out a single photograph, matte, aged, and brutal. There was no sound as he raised the photo and turned it outward. No announcement, no explanation, just a slow reveal, steady and surgical. The image spoke for itself. A face, swollen on the left side, purple blooming from temple to cheekbone, blood dried beneath the nostrils. One eye was nearly shut from impact. The background, a holding cell, cinder block walls, a number scrawled above a rusted bench. No name, no timestamp, but none of that was needed. Brent's voice cracked the stillness like a splinter. Wait, he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. His eyes narrowed, then widened, then squinted, as if that would change what he was seeing. Wait a minute. That face? Rick leaned in. His chair creaked, the plastic groaning beneath the sudden weight of recognition. He squinted, his mouth frozen half open, the color draining just a shade from his already pale cheeks. No, he muttered, almost too low to hear. No, it can't be. Isaiah didn't flinch. His fingers didn't tremble. His voice, when it came, was stripped of theatrics. If your memory chose to forget, he said evenly, then allow me to refresh it. He let the words hang. Not a question, not a threat, a reminder, a reckoning. Brent shook his head once, like trying to flick away a thought before it rooted. I've processed hundreds, he began, but stopped, because what he meant was, I've broken too many faces to remember that one. But he didn't say it. He didn't have to. Rick sat back, slowly, as if gravity had gained a few pounds. His eyes didn't leave the photo, not because he was trying to place it, but because part of him already had. That expression, dazed, bleeding, quiet. The silence in the photo looked familiar, the kind of stillness a man forces onto his face when there's no protection left but composure. Isaiah returned the photograph to the file and closed it without comment. He didn't name the date. He didn't name the officers. He didn't name the victim. Names weren't necessary. The picture had already completed its work. Truth, after all, didn't always need to be shouted. Sometimes it needed only to be held up and stared at until someone else blinked first. Brent opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. The denial he'd been preparing dissolved in the back of his throat. Rick looked away, not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of the possibility. What if that had been him? What if that's the moment this all began? What if their past didn't stay buried because it had never really been underground to begin with? Isaiah remained still, a judge not merely presiding, but haunting. The courtroom, once filled with cold skepticism, now felt more like a confessional. The air itself leaned in. No one moved. Even the clerk's fingers hovered over her keys, waiting for the moment the unspoken would finally be given shape. But Isaiah didn't declare. He didn't connect the dots. He left the lines barely visible, just enough for those guilty to start drawing them on their own. He knew the anatomy of guilt. He knew that real fear isn't in the punishment. It's in the realization that the punishment has been watching you the whole time. He folded his hands. Some memories are accidents, he said softly. Some are crimes. Brent looked up sharply, mouth ready to retort, but Isaiah had already turned his gaze elsewhere. Not dismissive, strategic, like a chess player who'd already moved a piece 5 turns ago and was now waiting for the realization to set in. Rick exhaled sharply and rubbed a palm across his mouth. "Is this where we pretend this is about justice?" he said under his breath, bitter like a swallowed pill. "Or is this just about dragging us back through the mud?" No answer came, because there wasn't one that would make it less true. Isaiah didn't look at them again. He didn't need to. The photograph had done its work, and the silence that followed was louder than anything they could scream, because now they remembered, and worse than being accused, they knew they'd seen that face before. The silence following the photograph had not lifted. It had thickened, condensed into something colder than stillness, something alive. Brent shifted in his seat as if trying to outrun a memory he now recognized too late. Rick's eyes hadn't moved from the bench, though his fingers tapped an unconscious rhythm of rising dread. Isaiah remained seated for a moment longer, letting the pressure build not from volume, but from presence. He watched them, not as a man demanding anything, but as a man who had already taken control. Then, slowly, without drama, Isaiah stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam his hand or call attention to himself. He simply rose, as if the truth itself had permitted him to move. His robe settled around him like a storm given form. Every eye in the courtroom turned to him, but he looked only at Brent. "You," he said, his tone cutting through the tension like a scalpel through nerve. "You look at me, and you think I'm just another black man you once put in a cell. You think I'm someone you forgot, someone you can still dismiss. You think memory is yours to control, that you get to decide what fades." Brent's posture buckled slightly, the arrogance draining from his shoulders like air from a punctured lung. Rick shifted, defensive, lips parting as if to interrupt, but Isaiah's hand lifted, not as a warning, but as a strike aimed with words. "You're wrong," Isaiah continued, now stepping out from behind the bench. "You didn't just beat a man that night. You tried to erase him. You tried to bury him beneath paperwork and spit, beneath your protocol and your jokes, beneath the silence you thought no one would ever hear." Now Isaiah pointed, a slow, deliberate gesture. Not out of rage, but out of authority, the kind that didn't need force because it was truth made visible. His finger landed squarely on Brent. But I wasn't buried. I wasn't erased. I was transformed. You thought you were ending something when you threw my ID into that drain. You thought you were stepping on a neck, but you were forging something. Something colder. Something harder. Something with memory sharper than yours will ever be. Brent opened his mouth. A protest half formed, but Rick spoke first. He snapped upright, incredulous, squinting at Isaiah like trying to pull the past into the present. "Wait," he barked, voice sharp, cracked by realization. It's you? That kid? That night? That's you?" Isaiah turned to face him. His expression didn't change. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "No," he said, letting the pause hover like a blade. "Not that kid. Not that thug. Not that inmate. I'm the judge now." Rick blinked like he'd just been hit in the mouth. His jaw locked, but his breath faltered. Rent didn't speak, couldn't. His mouth twitched like it wanted to summon denial, but the weight of the moment pinned him in place. The courtroom didn't gasp. It didn't erupt. It sank deep, slow, into the gravity of revelation. Every person in the room felt the drop, the snapping of illusion, the instant awareness that the narrative had turned, not through surprise, but through precision. Isaiah continued, pacing not with drama but with deliberation. "I didn't come here to relive that night. I didn't spend 10 years waiting to confront you. I came here to redefine the rules you thought you wrote in permanent ink. I came here to stand in the same room where you used to mock the law and show you what the law looks like when it remembers." He circled the bench, not as a man retreating to safety, but as a storm surveying its eye. You thought justice was a uniform, a baton, a clipboard, and a smirk. But justice is not a weapon. It's not a privilege. It's a mirror. And today, it's holding your face. No one moved. No one coughed. Even the stenographer paused, hands suspended above the keys like the air might snap if touched too soon. "I don't need to remember," Isaiah said, final now, anchoring each word like a nail, "because I never forgot." And just like that, the bench wasn't wood, it was a reckoning, and the man behind it wasn't a victim, he was a verdict. The truth had landed, but Isaiah was not done. His voice hadn't trembled. His eyes hadn't softened. He didn't pause to let them catch up, because they were never supposed to. Revelation was not a courtesy. It was a reckoning. And now, as the courtroom swam in the aftershock of who he was, Isaiah chose his next words with the cold care of someone carving into stone. He didn't raise the photograph again. He didn't point. He simply spoke, his voice quieter now, but every syllable chiseled with purpose. "When I was taken into custody that night, no one asked my name. They didn't need to. They had a category, a placeholder. I wasn't Isaiah. I wasn't a person. I was male black number 4. He let the phrase hang in the air. Clinical, brutal, burned into institutional language. It didn't sound like a mistake. It sounded like a sentence. The silence that followed wasn't sympathetic. It was sickening, because everyone in the room knew what it meant when a name was replaced with a number. It meant you didn't count. Not as a citizen, not as a man, only as a statistic, a blur in the lineup, a body in the system, something to be processed and filed without pause. Isaiah's voice didn't crack, but it cut. They misspelled my last name in the intake form. Didn't care. They marked me down as hostile, even though I said nothing. Didn't matter. I wasn't being recorded. I wasn't being heard. I wasn't a memory. I was a line item. Brent shifted. Eyes narrowing, posture stiff. "There are hundreds of reports," he snapped, his tone defensive, almost annoyed. "We don't remember every name. You think you're the only one? You think it's personal? It's not. There are too many. That's how this job works." Isaiah turned to face him fully, gaze hard, sharp, without flinch. "You're right," he said. "You don't remember every name. You don't have to. You're trained not to. That's what protects you. That's how you survive. By turning people into paperwork. By telling yourselves it wasn't a face, it was a form, not a life, a label." He took one step forward, voice dropping into a lower register that didn't just demand attention, it demanded silence. "But I remember you. Brent recoiled slightly, like the words had weight, like hearing them spoken aloud made them suddenly real. Isaiah didn't blink. I don't remember every officer who hit me, who dragged me, who mocked me. I don't remember every hand that signed my silence, but I remember yours. I remember your voice. I remember your boots. I remember your laugh when I asked for water. His words weren't shouted, they were delivered like facts. Clean, crisp, irrefutable. When he said slavery ended, Rick tried to cut in, his voice flippant, brittle. So what now? You want revenge? You want to play martyr and saint in one move? Come on, man. You got your robe, you made it, and now you're here to make it about the past? Isaiah didn't turn to him. He didn't need to. His words addressed the room, but the crosshairs never shifted. This isn't about revenge. Revenge is emotional. This is about accounting. You wrote me out of my name. You made me forget how to be called anything but a charge. Now, I'm just returning the ledger. He stepped back to the bench, his hands calm, his voice colder than before. Let the record show that on that night, I was not charged. I was not convicted. I was not booked under a name. I was entered into a system as a threat, without speech, without protest, without acknowledgement. He paused, one breath, then added, but I never left. Rick leaned back, his chair creaking with a weight he could no longer shrug off. Brent looked down at the table, not out of shame, but because power, for the first time, wasn't in his corner. It was standing over him, wearing a robe, speaking his name not as an accusation, but as a judgment earned. Isaiah didn't gloat. His face didn't change. He sat again, slowly, deliberately, gaze forward, voice measured. This isn't about what you forgot. It's about what I was forced to remember every single day in silence. The echo of being processed without identity. The echo of being stripped of something that was mine before you ever knew my face. He placed his hand gently on the bench, not as punctuation but as presence. I don't need you to remember my name now. You'll remember who said it, and that was all. The room was still echoing with Isaiah's final words from the last session, and yet as the court reconvened, the temperature felt colder, heavier. It was no longer just about what Brent and Rick had done. It was about what had been allowed, what had been tolerated, what had thrived in silence. As Isaiah didn't rise immediately, he remained seated, fingers calmly laced over a manila folder that looked no different from the hundreds of others that passed through that courthouse. But the weight inside that folder was not paper. It was history, suppressed, sanitized, and finally summoned. Your Honor, he began, voice deliberate, tone stripped of ornament. I request the court's permission to submit supplemental discovery, internal files recently unsealed from the 11th Precinct, stamped restricted access for the past decade. There was a flicker in the courtroom, a shift not in movement but breath. Rick's jaw tensed. Brent leaned forward, ever so slightly. The judge nodded. Isaiah stood and approached the exhibit screen, sliding in the first scan, a spreadsheet, unassuming at first glance. 17 names, 17 dates, 17 arrest records, but each one had a missing component. No incident reports, no signed affidavits, no official booking forms, just a digital footprint that a person had once been taken and then somehow erased. Isaiah turned to the court. These are the records of 17 individuals detained by Officer Brent Keller between 2010 and 2018. None of these resulted in formal charges. None of them were recorded in arrest logs. All of them were people of color. Rick let out a short laugh that tried to pass as disbelief but landed as fear wrapped in mockery. We were cleaning up the streets. You want to dig into paperwork while real crime grows? Isaiah didn't look at him. He didn't need to. He tapped the screen. I am not digging into paperwork, Mr. Daly. I am exhuming ghosts your precinct buried with a keyboard and a badge. He pulled up the second document, an email thread from 2015 between Brent and a former precinct captain. The subject line was one word, containment. The thread included one chilling line from from Brent. Better to rough them up and forget the paperwork than let them think they can scream their way into power. That single sentence passed through the courtroom like a scalpel. One spectator gasped. Another whispered, "Jesus." The judge straightened in her chair. Brent's face darkened, but not with shame, with calculation. "That was taken out of context," he said, voice tight. "It was a tense time, high-risk neighborhoods." Isaiah cut him off. "High risk?" He turned back to the screen, pulling up a neighborhood map. All 17 arrests took place within a 12-mile radius, predominantly black, predominantly low income, predominantly unheard. "You called this containment, Mr. Keller," Isaiah said, "but the law does not exist to cage the inconvenient." Rick looked to Brent, then back at Isaiah. "You're twisting this into some racial crusade." Isaiah raised an eyebrow. "I don't have to twist what was already coiled like a noose." He clicked forward again. Photo evidence. Faces. Some of them were bruised, some hollowed out by fear, some just gone. No follow-up, no legal representation, no trace in the system. 17 lives were suspended in limbo because someone decided they weren't worth the ink of a report. That is not enforcement. That is deletion. Brent shifted, his voice hardening. "You think you're some prophet, Isaiah? This courtroom isn't therapy. It's not your soapbox." Isaiah let the silence stretch. Then, as if every syllable had been sharpened for this exact moment, he replied, "No, Mr. Keller. This courtroom is a reckoning, and I am not a prophet. I am proof." The weight of that line didn't drop like a bomb. It settled like dust on lungs, heavy, suffocating, irreversible. He returned to the podium, fingers now unfastening a second folder. Witness testimonies. Affidavits from ex-officers, now retired or dismissed, who corroborated patterns of undocumented aggression led by Brent, often with Rick by his side. One note, in particular, drew blood. There was an unofficial quota, not arrests, suppressions. Isaiah didn't need to explain. The phrase explained itself. Suppressions, detentions that didn't require legal validation, just brute presence. It wasn't justice, it was domination by omission. "The question isn't whether you broke the law," Isaiah said, locking eyes with Brent. "It's how long the law lets you be its impersonator." Brent exhaled through his nose, fighting to hold composure. His lips curled, voice laced with sarcasm. "So, this is it. You want my badge on a pike? A parade of shame?" Isaiah replied with the calm of a man who had already buried 1,000 screams. "I don't want your badge. I want your silence to stop being louder than our screams." Rick looked down at the table now, the grin gone. Sweat gathered at his temple. There was no camaraderie left between them, no shield against shared guilt. Just two men, slowly realizing that the system they thought would shelter them had been hollowed from within. Isaiah closed the folder, looked at the judge, then at the jury, then back at the exhibit screen, now filled with faces the system tried to forget. "I present this not just as evidence of misconduct," he said, voice low but unmistakably resolute, "but as an autopsy of a system that confused force with justice." The court was silent. No scribbling pens, no shifting chairs. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to dim, unable to bear the glare of the truth being unearthed. No one applauded, but something cracked in the air. Not just fear, not just shame. Recognition, the kind that couldn't be unseen and would not be forgiven. The courtroom still hadn't exhaled. The images, the voices, the records from the 11th precinct were still hanging in the air like smoke no one could wave away. As Isaiah returned to his seat, the silence was taut, metallic. No one looked at Brent. Rick barely looked at himself. Something had shifted, not a climax, a slow collapse. It came quietly at first, a shuffle of papers, a whisper to counsel, then a formal request. Rick Daly would like to make a statement. The judge raised her brow. The room turned. Rick rose, not with confidence, but with the posture of a man whose spine was starting to remember guilt. He didn't speak right away. His hands fidgeted near the edge of the table, but there was no swagger now, no biting sarcasm, just tremors. Then he cleared his throat, forcing words out that didn't taste like his own. I've been advised to cooperate with the prosecution, he said, fully. Brent's head jerked toward him like a blade drawn on instinct. His voice came sharp, like a whip crack. Don't you dare. But Rick didn't even meet his eyes. He faced forward. There's a file from 2013, internal footage. It was logged after an incident involving an individual brought in without cause. No report filed. The file was later deleted. He paused, then added with a mechanical coldness, on Brent Keller's orders. A soundless vacuum seemed to swallow the room for half a second. Isaiah did not flinch. The judge leaned in. The jury took note. Brent stood, slow and deliberate. Lies from a coward don't become truth just because they're spoken in court. Rick finally turned to him. His face wasn't defiant, it was hollow. I didn't lie when I helped you cover it up. I'm only lying now if I keep my mouth shut. Brent's lips curled, voice soaked in disdain. You think they'll spare you because you flipped? They'll hang us both. Only difference is, I'll keep my dignity. Rick let out a laugh so dry it cracked. Dignity? Brent, you crushed a man's face against a locker while I turned the camera off. We didn't have dignity. We had an audience of silence, and you wanted more. Brent took a step forward. The judge intervened. Mr. Keller, sit down. But Brent wasn't listening. He was unraveling. Every step Rick took toward confession scraped a layer off the man who once believed his badge made him immortal. Rick turned to Isaiah, unable to meet his gaze directly. The video file was named 6_17 IA, Internal Archive. It captured what happened to you, and we erased it, because we knew you'd never be believed. Isaiah stood now, not to interrupt, not to retaliate, but to speak. You erased it, he said softly, not because you were afraid of what it showed, but because you believed no one would care, even if it was seen. Rick sat, shoulders caving inward. Isaiah's voice, by contrast, only grew steadier. The betrayal was never mine. I never broke a promise to this system. You did. You both believed the system was a mirror that reflected power only to those who held it. But the cracks were always there, and now they reflect. Brent stared at Rick with a hatred so concentrated it stripped the room of temperature. His words, when they came, were bitter enough to corrode steel. You little rat, you think this saves you? This courtroom is a show. When the lights go off, you'll still be nothing. A cop who squealed. Rick didn't respond. He didn't have to, because the courtroom was no longer reacting to Brent. The room had shifted its weight toward Isaiah. Brent's voice had stopped mattering. Isaiah walked slowly to the evidence stand, folder in hand. He said nothing flashy, just opened it. As part of Mr. Daly's cooperation, we have recovered the metadata logs of the deleted footage, and though the file itself was corrupted, the deletion request was not. It came from a terminal under the direct password of Officer Brent Keller. No gasp this time, just stillness, the kind of stillness that only comes when something breaks beneath the surface, and the water never moves again. Brent's attorney leaned in to whisper. Brent batted his hand away, still trying to command a war that had already burned through his ranks. Isaiah closed the folder. The system didn't betray you, Mr. Keller. It obeyed you, and now it will answer with the same efficiency it once afforded your silence. The statement landed like a guillotine blade. Not fast, just final. The judge recessed the court for lunch. Spectators dispersed in murmurs, but Brent remained frozen, and Rick sat like a man whose armor had turned to ash. He didn't ask for redemption. He didn't even seem to believe in it. He had simply run out of places to hide. Outside the window, a child was playing with chalk on the sidewalk, drawing lines that would vanish with the next rain, but inside, lines were being etched in memory, not chalk, carved. Isaiah returned to his bench. He didn't gloat, he didn't smile, he just watched, as the system that had once swallowed him now struggled to digest its own. The echoes of Isaiah's words had barely faded when the courtroom doors reopened and the world outside finally caught up to the fire burning inside. Cameras lined the hall like vultures circling truth. Headlines had already started writing themselves, but the moment still demanded more. It demanded a voice not from the media, but from the man who had walked into a courtroom once defined by silence and redrew the entire architecture of power. Isaiah stood not behind the bench, not at the podium, but in front of the courthouse steps. The afternoon light poured over his shoulders, casting him in contrast, not of shadow, but reckoning. Journalists lifted microphones, spectators quieted, and Brent, standing in the background, now just another face among the forgotten, tried to shrink inside his uniform. Isaiah didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence had become its amplifier. "The day I was arrested," he began, his eyes scanning the crowd, "I wore a white dress shirt. I had just come from a job interview. I was told I looked like a drug dealer." A hush swept over the crowd. "Today," he continued, motioning toward his black judicial robe, "I wear the garb of a judge, and I am told I am biased, that I should recuse myself, that my experience disqualifies me from fairness." He took one step forward, deliberate, control, like a verdict walking into existence. "So tell me," he asked, eyes now locked with the cameras, "what should I wear to be treated like a man? What color cloth does justice recognize as human?" No one answered. No one dared, not even Brent. The silence was no longer Isaiah's enemy. It was now his accomplice. Behind him, a clerk approached the press with documents in hand, an official recommendation. Brent Keller was to be stripped of all service medals, commendations, and special honors. Every piece of polished metal that had once gleamed on his chest would be archived, nullified, or destroyed. Rick Daly had already been removed from active duty, his ID badge deactivated. His name was quietly purged from the department database. The system had begun the ritual it knew best, erasing those who embarrassed its image. But Isaiah wasn't interested in embarrassment. He was interested in exposure. He turned back toward the building and then paused. A journalist asked, trembling, "Do you feel vindicated, Judge Rivers?" Isaiah smiled. Not out of joy, but something far more unshakable. "I don't feel vindicated," he said, "because that would imply I was ever wrong. I wasn't. I was simply ignored." He reached into his robe and held up a folded, laminated copy of the arrest form from years ago, still stained with red marker, still bearing the words, "Subject non-compliant, no ID, possible threat." His name had been misspelled. His profession is left blank. His skin was noted. His voice was omitted. "This isn't just a document," he said. "It's a mirror of what you see when you don't want to see a man." Brent, still flanked by his counsel, shifted. His voice cut through the press like a blade trying to find flesh. "You think this undoes what happened? You think shaming me in public makes you noble?" Isaiah didn't flinch. He didn't even look at him. He looked at the badge, still pinned to Brent's chest, now dull under sunlight. "A badge is meant to represent duty," he said. "But when worn by someone without honor, it becomes nothing more than a coin used to purchase fear." Brent's lips parted to speak again, but Isaiah raised a hand, not to silence, but to seal. "Don't explain, don't excuse, don't beg the world to believe you were once good. If your honor depended on people not watching, it was never honor." And just like that, Brent lowered his eyes. For the first time, he seemed to understand. Not defeat, but exposure, the kind you don't recover from, the kind that follows you long after the cameras turn away. Isaiah stepped back, allowing the officials to hand Brent the formal letter of disciplinary action. Every word was a requiem for a career that once masqueraded as valor. Every sentence is a shovel full of dirt tossed over the coffin of a lie. Nearby, Rick exited through the side gate, his head down. No press, no crowd. Just a man walking into the same silence he once weaponized. There were no punches, no curses, only distance. And Isaiah, standing alone once more, looked at the city, not in victory, but in reminder. "They called me a threat when I was silent. They call me dangerous now that I speak. Maybe what they fear," he said, voice softer than before, but razor-sharp, was never me. Maybe what they fear is that I am still standing. He turned and walked back inside the courthouse, not because he had more to say, but because the weight of truth had already spoken, and it wore no badge. It didn't need one. Isaiah had just crossed the threshold of the courthouse doors when the past returned, uninvited but perfectly timed. A junior clerk approached with a sealed folder, marked in red, Archival Recognitions Unit. No explanation, no context. Just one sentence muttered beneath breath. It was flagged during the disciplinary review. Isaiah opened it in silence. Inside, a framed image of Brent Keller receiving a department commendation in 2013. A golden badge affixed above a typed citation that read, "For exceptional courage in the apprehension of a violent suspect during an unplanned street engagement. Officer Keller exhibited restraint and valor under threat." The signature at the bottom belonged to a former precinct captain. The date, June 17, 2013. Isaiah didn't blink. He didn't breathe for a moment. The date was not just familiar. It was carved into bone. That was the night. The same night he had been thrown against the hood of a car. The same night a steel boot had crushed his shoulder into concrete. The same night his blood painted the sidewalk in front of an empty deli, and a voice behind him said, "Don't move or you'll make it worse." And now that night was a medal. He didn't speak to the clerk. He walked past, down the marble hallway, folder in hand, back into the courtroom. No session had yet resumed. The judge was in chambers, the audience was sparse, but Brent was there, sitting alone. No counsel now, no uniformed support, just a lapel pin stripped of its backing, and hands clenched like fists trying to remember how to feel powerful. Isaiah walked slowly to the evidence table, set the folder down with purpose. Then he removed the citation and its accompanying photo, placed them side by side. Brent turned slightly. His expression flickered. He recognized the frame. "You brought that back to humiliate me?" Isaiah didn't answer, not yet. He adjusted the photo to ensure the date was visible. Then he lifted his eyes. "This citation," Isaiah said, voice calm and grave, "was awarded to you for neutralizing a threat. Do you recall the circumstances?" Brent scoffed. "It was over a decade ago. A hostile subject. Non-compliant, caused disturbance. I stepped in." "You stepped on me." The words landed like granite. Brent's eyes narrowed. "That night you were awarded for valor," Isaiah continued, "was the night I bled into pavement. You were honored not for what you prevented, but for what you caused, and made look like prevention." Brent's mouth curled, defensive. "The system evaluated my actions. It validated them. It rewarded them." Isaiah stepped closer. "A system can mislabel a wound as a badge. That doesn't make it honorable. It makes it dangerous." He held up the image. "This photograph, this ceremony, was built on a falsified report. The same report you ordered Rick to help erase. The same report that now sits in shredded metadata and silent surveillance footage." Brent gritted his teeth. His voice dipped into venom. "You want to rewrite history, Rivers. That's all this is. You want to wear a robe and pretend your scars are sacred." Isaiah didn't flinch. "I don't need to rewrite history. I just need to read it out loud." He looked toward the small gallery. Not full, but enough ears, enough eyes. This medal was not earned. It was laundered, cleaned with the silence of everyone who chose not to ask who the so-called suspect was. It was pressed into your chest the same week I couldn't lift mine to defend myself in court, because the only image they had was of me on the ground. Brent stood now. His fists shook. "You think if you smear everything I've done, you get to be clean? You're just another man who couldn't take the heat back then and decided to become a martyr after the fact." Isaiah stepped forward, closing the final distance between them. "No, I didn't become a martyr. I became memory, and that's what you can't silence." He lifted the medal from its box, stared at it, then placed it on the table. "This is not a symbol of service. This is the receipt for the price I paid to be forgotten." Brent looked away, his shoulders hunched not in fear, but in collapse. "You want the whole city to think I was a monster." Isaiah turned his back to him, slowly, with intent. I don't need them to think anything, I just need them to see. And as he walked back to the bench, the courtroom door opened. A bailiff stepped in and announced the next session, but no one moved, not yet, because truth had taken form, not as fire, not as furious, but as a polished medal lay beside a man who no longer had the rank to wear it, and a voice echoing in the room, quiet but seismic. Medals rust, blood remembers. The gavel hadn't fallen yet, but the verdict had, and it was irreversible. The air was still charged from the last blow Isaiah had delivered. The medal sat untouched, a golden artifact of a crime dressed as courage, and the courtroom walls, once indifferent, now felt as though they held their breath. But Isaiah wasn't finished. The moment hadn't yet fulfilled its duty. Not until the man who once bent the law with his fists was forced to touch it with trembling hands. The judge re-entered, gave a silent nod, and Isaiah stood. He didn't raise his voice, but there was something in the way his tone curved, like steel coiled with precision. With the court's permission, I would like to proceed with a direct exercise. No one objected. Brent remained seated, sullen, silent. Isaiah walked over to the exhibit table and retrieved a binder. Its cover was plain. Its contents are anything but. "Officer Keller," he said, "deliberate with the title. Since you've long claimed to act within the bounds of legal necessity, I'd like you to read aloud for the jury and the court the exact language of Article 4, Title 2 of the state constitution regarding the inalienable rights of detained persons." Brent didn't move. His jaw tightened. Isaiah didn't blink. "Page 12, line 6, highlighted in yellow." The bailiff placed the binder in front of Brent. Brent stared at it, motionless. The judge's voice cut through. "Mr. Keller, proceed." With hands that once slammed doors and twisted arms, Brent now fumbled to open the cover. His fingers hovered above the page, as if hoping the words would rise and read themselves. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Nothing came. Isaiah stepped closer, but not too close, close enough for the weight of irony to be unbearable. You spent years teaching your subordinates that force was clarity, that a fist delivered faster answers than a warrant. Yet now, faced with the ink of law, not the illusion of control, you're silent. Brent cleared his throat, finally stammering, "Any person under date detention shall be treated." He paused, swallowed hard. The next words refused to cooperate. Isaiah tilted his head. "Continue." Brent's voice cracked. "Shall be treated with dignity and shall not be subject to cruel or unreasonable." "Unreasonable what?" Isaiah pressed. Brent closed his eyes. "Force." The word barely escaped. Isaiah nodded slowly. "And that is the first time you've ever read that line? Not as a slogan to ignore, not as a clause to circumvent, but as a commandment. One you failed." Brent snapped the binder shut with a clumsy jerk. "This is a performance. You want to parade shame like justice." Isaiah stepped forward, voice low and blade sharp. "No, this is the classroom you skipped, where the law you bent is now bending you. You used to teach rookies that the law was what your baton said it was. Now, read the law as it is." Brent stood, but there was no fight in it. His posture sagged with something worse than fatigue, recognition. "I made decisions in the moment," he said, grasping for ground. "Situational urgency? No," Isaiah cut in. "You made doctrine out of aggression. You crafted urgency where there was none. You turned discomfort into probable cause. And now, the law you twisted into a weapon has straightened itself into a mirror." The judge remained silent. The jury stared. Brent shifted, trying to reclaim composure, but his uniform looked baggy now, as if even the fabric knew it didn't belong to him anymore. Isaiah turned to the court. "Let the record show the man who once enforced the law by volume now cannot speak its text. That is not a lapse. That is a revelation." A murmur swept through the back benches. Brent sat, deflated. Isaiah returned to his place, eyes never leaving the man who once taught a generation of officers that control was righteousness. Brent had played God with badges and handcuffs. Now he was a student, and the lesson was engraved in silence. Force doesn't absolve ignorance. Isaiah added, voice steady. And violence doesn't substitute for knowledge. You taught with your fists. Today you learn from the very claws you buried. Brent didn't reply. He couldn't. The binder lay open again, this time untouched, its yellow highlight glowing under courtroom lights like a wound that refused to close. Isaiah sat down, and in that motion, in that calm folding of his hands, the courtroom knew this was not vengeance. It was the curriculum. One man had ruled with instinct, the other with memory, and today memory won. Isaiah remained seated only long enough for silence to reclaim its power. The binder lay flat on the table, Brent's failed recital still echoing inside every ear that once believed uniform spoke truth. But now Isaiah stood again, not with the weight of ceremony but with the rhythm of memory, steady and irreversible. This wasn't just a trial. It had become a ledger, and one final entry remained to be written. He walked slowly to the bench, his left hand reaching into a small envelope tucked within his case files. From it, he drew a photograph, creased at the edges, faded but unflinching. He held it not for the court, not for the cameras, but for Brent, for Rick, for anyone who had once believed that bruises disappear when the headlines fade. This photo, he said, holding it up without trembling, was taken 10 years ago. It shows a hand, swollen, discolored, hairline fractures along the third and fourth metacarpals. That hand belonged to me. He walked forward and placed the photo on the evidence projector. It flashed onto the courtroom screen. A hand, battered and wrapped in thin gauze, bones jutting unnaturally beneath stretched skin. No name, no context, just pain, documented in silence. Isaiah didn't flinch as the image loomed large behind him. He simply turned, eyes locked with Rick. You remember this, don't you? The night in the alley. The kick you delivered when I was already face down. You thought I raised that hand to fight, but I raised it to shield, to survive, to delay the second impact. Rick didn't speak. He didn't blink. Isaiah placed his current hand, whole now, controlled, on the wooden surface of the evidence table. His palm met oak like a seal against parchment. This hand once shook beneath hospital light. Now it delivers rulings. It once curled inward in pain. Now it rises to strike a gavel. It once absorbed a blow meant to erase me. Now it returns, not in vengeance, but in verdict. He lifted the gavel. You taught that power is what crushes. I learned that power is what endures. This hand, he said, pausing as the courtroom leaned in, has never forgotten the weight of your boot. But it also knows the feel of the law, and only one of those deserves to be permanent. Brent tried to speak, but his words died at the gate of his disbelief. The photograph behind Isaiah was no longer just an image. It had become scripture. And Isaiah, he was no longer just a man. He was now history in motion. He looked to the jury, not to sway them, to remind them. The hand you see is not proof of suffering, it is proof of survival. You cannot decorate that, you cannot erase it, you cannot call it mistaken identity. He turned again to Rick. You thought you could knock memory from muscle, but trauma doesn't bruise and vanish. It grows roots, it waits, it watches. And one day, it stands in court, wearing a robe. Rick's lips quivered, not in rage, not even regret, in fear, the kind that comes when history stops being abstract and starts speaking directly. Isaiah lowered the gavel. Let this courtroom remember, the hand that once blocked violence now upholds justice. The same hand, not replaced, not avenged, just remembered. No one applauded. It would have insulted the solemnity. Even the judge remained silent, her breath shallow. Isaiah placed the gavel back into its cradle, not as punctuation, but as prophecy. He picked up the photo once more, slid it into the record. Exhibit sealed. He said softly, pain authenticated. Then he returned to his seat, hand steady, back unbent. He didn't look at Brent. He didn't need to, because the story had just changed. The hand that had once trembled now wrote the last chapter, and there was no one left in that courtroom who could stop it from doing so. Isaiah did not rise immediately. He let the weight of what had just been said settle like dust in the lungs of the room. Brent sat frozen, Rick barely breathing, and the photograph of the broken hand still lingered in every eye like an imprint that refused to fade. The air was reverent, not out of respect, but out of recognition. What came next was no longer a matter of argument. It was a sentence. Then Isaiah stood. His robe, now familiar to all, seemed less like a symbol of status and more like a mantle forged by pain, carried with discipline. He moved toward the bench with the calm of a man who had not waited for permission to speak truth, only for the right moment to pronounce it. When he reached the podium, he took a breath, not for composure, for clarity. "This is not about revenge," he began. "It never was. Revenge aims to reverse suffering, but justice removes the weapon from the hand that misused it. Charge me with as much odium as you will. The diameter of the hand." He glanced at Rick, then at Brent. "I will not have you escorted out in handcuffs, not because you don't deserve them, but because I will not give you the comfort of victimhood." Brent flinched. Rick looked down. Isaiah's voice was quiet, but each word was polished to precision. "You once thought your power came from authority, from badges, from rank, from the silence of others. But what you had was not power. It was permission. Borrowed, fragile, conditional." He held up the final written statement. "And today I revoke that permission." He turned to the judge. "This court, by full agreement of the panel and supporting evidence, issues the following penalties." He stepped back, letting the words fall with measured gravity. "Brent Keller, you are hereby stripped of your pension, your commendations, and your eligibility for public service. You are barred in perpetuity from serving in any law enforcement, military, or security capacity in the United States or its territory." Brent's face did not twitch, but something behind his eyes cracked, the kind of fracture that sound cannot reach. Isaiah did not stop. "Rick Daly, you are sentenced to compensatory damages in a civil action for use of excessive force under color of authority, and likewise are barred from future roles in any policing, correctional, or enforcement body." Rick closed his eyes, accepting something that had no shape but all the weight of his past. Isaiah returned his gaze to the court. "I do not issue these consequences to silence you. I issue them because silence allowed you to exist unchecked. I do not take your freedom. I take away the shield you never earned and the gun you never respected." He paused. "I do not need to cage you. I need to uncage the system you corrupted." A hush blanketed the room again. Isaiah folded the verdict, handed it to the clerk, and finally turned to face Brent one last time. "You believed freedom was being able to walk out of a courtroom without chains. But freedom, true freedom, is knowing that no man, no uniform, no agency has the right to hold another unjustly." He leaned forward ever so slightly. "I don't free you. I just ended the illusion that you were ever holding me." Then he walked back, robe trailing like the final page of a book closing on a decade. No one clapped, but in every corner of that courtroom there was a shift, a quiet exhale, as if justice had not only been served, but spoken aloud in a language no one could deny. Behind him, Brent remained seated, unshackled, untouched, but unmistakably undone. And Rick, he didn't move at all, because sometimes the sentence isn't what is taken away, it's what is no longer feared, and that, Isaiah knew, was the beginning of actual freedom. Isaiah didn't wait for the cameras to swarm. He didn't look for the microphones extended like spears wrapped in velvet. As the gavel's echo died, he simply gathered his papers with the same hand that had once shielded his face from a boot, placed them neatly in his case, and walked out of the courtroom, not as a man being followed, but as a man walking toward closure. Outside, the press had assembled like a storm, with no forecast. Microphones glistened in the sun, and reporters leaned forward, hungry not for answers, but for sound bites. They shouted his name, flashed lights in his path, but Isaiah never broke stride, not for applause, not for confrontation, and certainly not for legacy. He walked past the marble columns, past the wide steps, through the crowd that parted not out of reverence but in awe of someone who no longer needed to be seen, to be heard. Some reached for him, hands brushing empty air, hoping to catch a quote, a gesture, a nod. But all he gave them was stillness, the kind that vibrated louder than any podium. When he reached the black sedan parked at the curb, the driver opened the door in silence. Isaiah paused, looked out across the faces, not with judgment, not with triumph, just with clarity. Then he stepped inside. Later that evening, as outlets scrambled to cover the fallout, to gather reactions, to frame what had happened as either a reckoning or a redemption, a single-line statement was delivered to every major newsroom. It was not a press release. It carried no official seal. It was handwritten, scanned, and signed in ink that did not try to sell anything. I am not a hero. I am simply a man who refused to be written as the villain in his own story. That was all. No elaboration, no explanation, no televised commentary. And yet, the statement was printed front page across 4 time zones, not because of its length, but because of its weight. For the first time in years, silence had spoken, and it had chosen its words carefully. In the days that followed, think pieces were drafted, panels assembled, commentators debated whether Isaiah Rivers was a symbol, a movement, or a myth in real time, but he did not appear again. No press conference, no late-night interviews, no book deal. The seat he once occupied behind the bench was respectfully left empty for a week, then quietly filled per protocol. But something had shifted. Across precincts, policies were reviewed. In locker rooms, the name Keller no longer drew solidarity, but discomfort. Training academies revised protocols, not in fear of another lawsuit, but because silence had finally cost them too much. The system hadn't collapsed, but it had blinked. And in the quiet neighborhoods where nothing ever made headlines, where uniforms still meant both protection and peril, a different kind of story began to circulate. Not about Isaiah the judge, but about a man who once bled into the street, stood back up, and spoke, with no volume but infinite gravity. He never needed to say it again. The image was enough. A raised hand, bruised, then healed, not pointing, not accusing, just open. The kind of open that says, I'm still here. The kind of open that says, this will not be rewritten. And for Brent and Rick, left behind in the wreckage of revoked power, the most unbearable part wasn't the loss of uniform or title. It was the knowledge that they would never again walk into a room unaware of who might be watching. Their era of shadowed certainty had ended, not with an explosion, but with the slow extinguishing of the right to be unchallenged. Because justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't announce itself with sirens. It walks quietly, past the crowd, past the noise, past the spectacle. It doesn't wait to be cheered. It waits to be understood, and when it's done, it does not linger. It simply leaves no place to hide. The day was neither stormy nor still, just forgettable enough to camouflage an ending, the kind of afternoon that left no fingerprints on the sky, no bruises on the air. In the courthouse parking lot, asphalt radiated heat like memory trying to leave skin. Rick Daly leaned against the side of his rust-colored pickup, head down, body shrunk into his uniform, as if hoping the faded fabric could erase the name stitched above his chest. He spotted him first, not from the sound of footsteps. Isaiah had long ago mastered the art of arrival without noise, but from the unmistakable gravity that trailed the man. Rick froze. His knuckles whitened around his key fob. Guilt moved faster than muscle. He pivoted away instinctively, pretending to fumble for something in the glove compartment. But shame, unlike fear, never asked for permission to linger. Only hours before, someone had graffitied the side of Rick's house with the words, "No badge can hide rot." The red paint hadn't dried evenly. A drizzle from dawn had warped the letters, making them look like they were still bleeding. His wife had called him in tears, not because of the message, but because their son refused to come out of the bathroom after seeing it. That morning, a letter had arrived from the state bar, a courtesy copy of a civil suit filed by the family of a boy Rick once escorted home with a dislocated shoulder and a fractured tooth. The envelope remained unopened in his glove box. On his his way into town, a teenager on a bicycle had recognized him, rode past in silence, then turned around and screamed, "Hey Rick, how do you sleep with that uniform choking your soul?" The shout echoed down the street until a screen door slammed somewhere behind it. Later, at a gas station, a woman he'd known for 15 years deliberately turned her back as he entered. She had once baked cookies for precinct birthdays. This time, she rearranged a shelf of magazines just to avoid meeting his eyes. None of it had been loud. None of it as violent. And yet each moment struck with more precision than any headline. There were no mobs, no shouting, just a deliberate choreography of exclusion, a silence sharpened by knowledge. Rick had spent years believing that noise was what made something real. Now it was the stillness that devoured him. Isaiah hadn't looked at him, hadn't spoken, hadn't even hesitated. He walked past with the calm of someone who no longer needed to make room for rage. Rick felt his knees wobble, not from confrontation, but from its absence. Even a reprimand would have felt redemptive. But Isaiah offered nothing, not even a glance. Somewhere in the back of Rick's mind, he remembered a time when he thought justice meant putting people in their place. It hadn't occurred to him that one day justice would arrive without a warrant, that it would simply pass by, unchanged by his collapse. Guilt moved faster than muscle. He pivoted away instinctively, pretending to fumble for something in the glove compartment. But shame, unlike fear, never asked for permission to linger. 10 feet away, Brent Keller stood, still wearing the same cologne of entitlement, only now it reeked of cowardice. He opened his mouth as Isaiah passed, lips twitching toward the syllables of an apology, but nothing came, not even a breath, just a silence thick enough to choke on. Brent's feet shuffled once, twice, then stopped. Because what do you say to a man whose silence had already sentenced you? Isaiah didn't pause. He didn't flinch. He walked through the parking lot as if the world had emptied itself of noise and left only consequence behind. His face bore no malice, no grace, no vindication. It bore history, the kind not archived in textbooks, but etched behind eyelids. He walked past the ghosts of his accusers, and not once did he grant them the dignity of a glance. Cameras followed, not for a story, but to record the absence of theatrics. When one journalist dared to ask, "Do you forgive them?" Isaiah didn't slow. The absence of reply rang louder than a press conference. Brent lingered there like a shadow, unwanted, unclaimed. A young mother passing by tugged her daughter's hand tighter as they skirted around him, whispering something neither of them would repeat aloud. In a nearby diner, his favorite table now hosted a printed sign that read, "Reserved for Decency." On campus, where he once gave guest lectures in criminal procedure, his nameplate had been quietly removed. No announcements. Just absence, just vacancy. He applied for a position at a private security firm, but the recruiter ended the interview with a single glance at the name on his resume, murmuring, "We no longer tolerate reputational risks dressed as experience." His wife had stopped making eye contact, not out of betrayal, but fatigue. It wasn't that she disbelieved him. She simply no longer had the strength to defend what he could not even explain. At the grocery store, he noticed the cashier double-bagging items for customers ahead, but when it was his turn, the man simply scanned, dropped, and turned away. No eye contact, no farewell. Brent stood in the parking lot now, not as a man, but as a marker of misjudgment, a living tombstone carved from privilege, cracked by consequence. Isaiah's figure grew smaller in the distance, swallowed by sunlight and exhaust fumes, but Brent could still feel the echo of him, not in sound, but in the air's refusal to carry his name. A boy nearby pointed at him and asked his father something. The father shook his head and turned the child away, as if to spare him from a cautionary tale, still breathing. Brant looked at his reflection in the pickup's window and saw not guilt or grief, but vacancy. A face once used to authority, now uncertain it deserved a mirror. A twitch of movement inside the vehicle caught his eye. A note, left by someone unknown, was taped to the dashboard. It read, "We see you, just not the way you hoped." He opened the door slowly, like a man unsure if the space inside still welcomed him. And as Isaiah turned the final corner, disappearing into the thinning late-day haze, the last remnants of noise slipped back into the world. Low car engines, distant birds, an air conditioner humming. Brent remained, rooted, no longer outraged, no longer an officer, just present, just visible enough to haunt. They had forgotten his face, but that face had not forgotten them. As he reached the driver's side of a charcoal sedan, he opened the door, settled in without a sound. The leather groaned gently beneath the weight of memory. On the passenger seat rested a worn leather notebook, its spine cracked from too many nights of holding in truth. The pages were yellowed, corners curled like they'd spent years in fists. Isaiah opened it slowly, turning to the final page. The sky beyond the windshield remained unchanged, smeared with indifferent clouds, the kind that neither threatened rain nor offered light, the kind that suited days like this, hollow and unceremonious. Behind him, the courthouse continued to shrink, its columns now nothing more than an outline against concrete. But inside the car, time stilled. The engine remained off. The world, for a moment, stopped asking for responses. Somewhere in the distance, someone laughed. Sharp, short, undeserving of the quiet. Isaiah didn't turn his head. His fingers hovered over the script in the notebook, tracing the grooves where ink had dried years ago. The same notebook that had once held accounts no court had time for, no agency had space for, just truths that refused to die. Outside, a group of college students passed by, each one glancing at the sedan, then averting their gaze, as if recognizing a silhouette from headlines they didn't want to remember aloud. One student, bold in a hoodie and headphones, stopped mid-step and pulled out a phone, snapped a picture of the car, and posted it with no caption. Within minutes, that image would be shared, filtered, dissected, not because of the man inside, but because of what the silence represented. Across the parking lot, Brent Keller stumbled through the lot, looking over his shoulder as if chased, though no one followed. He walked past two teenagers spray-painting a mural on the outer wall of a nearby building. It depicted faces, unapologetically black, defiantly scarred. Brent's own was nowhere to be found, but one figure in uniform, faceless and ghostly, had a crimson X painted across its badge. The teens didn't look up as he passed. They didn't need to. Their message wasn't for him. It was about him. Brent paused, then kept walking. At a bus stop not far off, a mother picked up her crying son, eyes darting to Brent as he approached. Her arms tightened. She stepped back, placing herself between the man and the bench. The little boy, unaware of the tension, kept crying, but the mother's stare made the weight clear. Brent didn't sit. He just stood there, suspended in social exile. No one needed to tell him to leave. They already had, with their posture, their eyes, their silence. Inside the car, Isaiah blinked once. His eyes didn't water. They sharpened. The final page remained in front of him, unread but not unseen. He remembered the day he wrote that line. He remembered the feeling in his wrist, the steadiness, the resolve. No anger had fueled it, only clarity. Behind that handwriting was not vengeance, but the anatomy of survival. A truck pulled into the lot, blasting music too loud for its speakers. The bass rattled the air. Rick Daly stepped out of the passenger side, hunched, smaller than memory. He saw the charcoal sedan and froze. The music dimmed as the driver turned the knob. Rick stood still, watching the back of Isaiah's head through the windshield. But Isaiah never turned, not even as Rick's fingers twitched with some aborted impulse wave, plea, excuse. The moment passed. Rick looked down and retreated toward the sidewalk. In the rearview mirror, Isaiah caught a glimpse of a sign on the side of a bakery window. "We reserve the right to refuse service to hate in uniform." The glass was clean, but the message was meant to leave a stain. Behind it, a young girl in a red apron handed out loaves with a smile too bright to be staged. Her glance passed over Rick as if he were already gone. He kept walking. Isaiah returned to the notebook, hand resting on the edge of the page. No crowd had formed, no microphone awaited. The world didn't know what this moment meant. That's why it mattered. There was no one to witness except memory itself, no one to applaud except silence. The page stayed open. The handwriting there was firm, unshaken, written not for readers, but for reckoning. It read, "Justice doesn't need applause. It only needs to stand." He closed the book. Behind him, Rick watched through a smudged windshield. unsure if the man he once brutalized had even seen him. The question itself was absurd. Isaiah had seen everything. He just no longer needed to look. Some days came with sirens and flashbulbs. Others arrived draped in the banality of weathered asphalt and indifferent sky. Today was the latter. A breeze moved without purpose. A bird landed, then flew again, leaving no imprint. It was in this stillness that consequences clung tighter, not to make noise, but to settle in. Brent Keller had tried not to show up. He had no reason to be near the courthouse, no business with any legal matter pending, but guilt had an impeccable sense of geography. It dragged him to the periphery of justice like a tide, returning to the periphery of justice like a tide, returning to the periphery of justice, like a tide returning to the periphery of justice, like a tide returning to the periphery of justice, like a tide. He was on Peter's way. He did that way too much already. He stood under a crooked street lamp, the kind that flickered not from malfunction, but fatigue, as if even light had grown tired of illuminating the undeserving. His coat was civilian now, yet the way it hung on him screamed displacement. His fingers reached into his pocket for a phone that buzzed not with notifications, but with reminders of meetings that no longer included him. The city had moved on, but it had remembered how he used to stand. A bus full of high school students passed by, its windows smeared with dust and years of apathy. One student, camera in hand, zoomed in on Brent and captioned the moment. "Guess who got ghosted by justice?" The post gained traction within minutes. Screenshots floated across platforms, each time edited slightly to add more mockery. In the comments, someone linked the dash cam footage. Someone else added a side-by-side of Brent's courtroom denial and Isaiah's silent exit. Brent didn't read it. He didn't need to. The world no longer asked for his version. At a corner cafe a few blocks down, a chalkboard sign stood out front. "We serve those who serve truth." A simple line, but the handwriting, sharp, slanted, was too familiar. Rick Daly paused as he passed it. The barista inside, a young man with sleeves inked in protest slogans, stared straight at Rick, then turned his back and kept pouring drinks. Not a word exchanged, just a mirror held up without glass. A block later, Rick stopped again. On the community bulletin board outside the library, a new flyer had been pinned. It wasn't for events or lost pets, it was a call to action, an open mic night for survivors of police misconduct. Headline: "Their voices, their terms." The bottom corner bore Isaiah's old badge number, crossed out in red. No name, no accusation, just memory weaponized as an invitation. Rick's hand twitched to tear it down, but his fingers didn't move. Guilt didn't grant that kind of agency. Back in the parking lot, a child no older than 7 ran up to the sedan, tugged by curiosity or some unspeakable instinct. His mother yanked him back just as he reached the window. She didn't scold, just held him tighter, whispering something about respect. The child turned once more to look at the man behind the glass, not in fear, in awe. Then he walked away. The mother nodded once toward the car, not knowing if she was seen, not caring. She had done her part. The rest was legacy. Isaiah remained still. The notebook was closed beside him. The engine remained off. The silence between events had thickened, like sap preserving the artifacts of a moment history might forget but never erase. The sky had not changed, nor had the courthouse. The asphalt, the door handles worn from decades of hands trying to grip justice. But the men, those had changed, not by choice, by pressure, by absence, by the kind of reckoning that arrived not in screams, but in the absence of excuses. Rick watched as Isaiah adjusted the rearview mirror, not to see behind, but to set the frame right. In that brief reflection, Rick caught his own eyes, smaller now, clouded with too many things never said. The mirror shifted again. Isaiah had let go of the past not by forgetting, but by choosing never to be shackled to it. His silence was not a retreat, it was recalibration. Rick wondered if he should have ended that silence, more than to retreat with a reputation that Rick couldn't recover. A delivery driver on a bike swerved around Brent without slowing. "Watch it, Ghost!" he called out, not even turning to look. Brent didn't react. His hands were in his pockets, his head down. He hadn't been spoken to, he'd been spoken through. Rick turned back to the car one last time. Isaiah's window remained rolled up, the man inside unmoved. Still, not as an act of defiance, but as the posture of permanence. He wasn't the storm that came and passed. He was the weather that changed the landscape. Brent turned away first, not out of disgust, but because some truths burn longer the longer you stare. Rick didn't move. He remained motionless, not from fear, but from the dawning weight of irrelevance. Whatever power he once abused, whatever lines he once crossed, they had all evaporated, not in a blaze, but in a quiet absence of acknowledgement. Isaiah adjusted his rearview mirror, not to look back, but to center himself. Then he turned the ignition. The engine hummed like something long dormant and finally at peace. Behind them, the world carried on. Traffic lights blinked, shoes tapped on concrete, phones buzzed with trivial urgency. But in the space they occupied, time dilated into memory. As the sedan eased into motion, it passed a bus stop where a laminated poster had been pinned just hours ago, an art student's final project. It showed a collage of faces, black and brown and lined by time, overlaid with courtroom transcripts and redacted police reports. At the center, a figure drawn from memory, alone, eyes closed, but unmistakably Isaiah. The caption read, "History has a face, and it remembers." Brent didn't dare look, not because he hadn't seen it, but because he had, and that was enough to peel the silence open like a wound. Across the street, a convenience store clerk pretended to sweep the sidewalk as the car rolled by, but in the display window, someone had scrawled across the glass, in dry erase, "This street has seen too many uniforms and too few apologies." Rick's gaze fell there, lingered, then lowered. It had not been written for him specifically, but it found him all the same. He said. The driver of a garbage truck parked near the courthouse leaned against the hood and lit a cigarette. He didn't speak, didn't nod, just turned his body slightly away from Brent, as if proximity itself was an accusation. The silence wrapped itself tighter. A little girl perched on a bench with her father pointed at Isaiah's car and whispered something. The father nodded solemnly, handed her a folded piece of paper. She clutched it, held it toward the passing vehicle, though it fluttered and fell before it could be seen. Still, she stood there, arm outstretched, as if offering something weightless that still mattered. The paper landed near Rick's feet. He didn't pick it up, not because he didn't care, but because he knew what it was. A child's drawing of a man standing tall, shadow cast wide. It was neither a caricature nor a tribute, just a silhouette defined by absence. Inside the sedan, Isaiah reached for the notebook again, fingertips grazing the edge, but not opening it. Not everything needed rereading, some pages only existed to be closed. Brant shifted on his heels as if preparing to step forward, but no step came. A woman pushing a stroller slowed as she passed him, narrowed her eyes, then crossed to the other side of the sidewalk without a word. It wasn't hostility, it was filtration. Brant had become something people instinctively moved around, like a bitter draft or an old bruise. Rick finally exhaled, his breath fogging briefly against the cooler air. The car's taillights blinked once as it turned at the corner, and as the car pulled away, neither Brent nor Rick followed with their eyes. Because sometimes, justice is not in what you watch, leave, but in what you know you can never chase again. The sedan disappeared down the avenue. The lot returned to stillness. And beneath a sky that remained unchanged, two men stood in the same place. But the world no longer turned for them. The silence afterward did not fill the space. It clarified it. Rick remained planted, one hand loosely resting on the hood of his truck, the other still curled as if holding on to some excuse he no longer had the breath to speak. Brant stood a few feet apart, the distance between them greater than when they had first arrived, widened by more than guilt. Their shadows, stretched long by the late sun, barely touched. On the far side of the lot, a teenager skated past, earbuds in, hoodie up, barely acknowledging the two men except for a moment's pause to mutter, "Still standing, huh?" before coasting away. He didn't need to stop. The internet had already moved on without waiting for their side of the story. From the second-floor window of the county records office, an administrator snapped a photo, not of Isaiah, of the men who watched him leave. By noon, the photo surfaced on a forum titled, "When Silence Falls Hardest." Comments multiplied. One user posted, "That's the look of men who know they lost to someone who never raised his voice." Another added a meme overlay, "When you realize the system turned its back because it saw what you did." Brent saw it later that night when his niece forwarded it without knowing he was in the frame. Her message was a single emoji, the eyes looking sideways. He didn't reply. Behind them, someone inside the courthouse opened the doors too hard, and a stack of papers fluttered onto the steps like startled pigeons. A passing custodian, one who'd once been told to enter through the back, bent to pick them up, noticed Rick, then chose not to acknowledge him, not out of spite, but irrelevance. Rick noticed. So did Brent. The roles they had once embodied now wore no skin, no breath, just dust. An elderly woman passed the lot slowly, her shopping cart squeaking with a rhythm that mocked the men's stillness. As she crossed in front of them, her eyes narrowed with something colder than hatred, disappointment worn down by time. In her cart was a hand-painted sign, likely left from a protest. No badge, no name, but "We remember faces." Brett caught the words, flinched. Rick didn't even lift his eyes. A group of college students parked near the curb, laughing loudly until they noticed the two figures by the truck. One of them, a girl in a denim jacket embroidered with stitched quotes, lowered her voice and whispered, "That's them, right? From the video?" Another nodded, filming them discreetly, captioning the moment, "When karma's GPS is exact." Her followers erupted. Hashtags reawakened. They watched him leave began trending by nightfall, attached not to Isaiah's face, but the expressions Brent and Rick wore, like broken masks. There was no need for names. Time thinned around them, stretched into a kind of purgatory that didn't punish through flames, but through forgetfulness. The courthouse remained behind them, but no one exited to greet them. No one nodded. Even the pigeons seemed to choose other places to land. The security guard who once greeted Rick daily now passed with a nod to someone else. Rick opened his mouth once to speak, to explain, maybe to justify, but the air swallowed it. Brent pulled his jacket tighter, not against the cold, but against exposure. Somewhere across town, a mural of Isaiah had gone up that morning. The artist, anonymous, had chosen a palette of grays and deep blue. No eyes, just the posture. Upright, immovable. Underneath the words, "Not loud, just right." Rick had seen the mural 2 days earlier, but hadn't told Brent, not out of secrecy, but shame. Brent saw it himself the next day when someone vandalized it by painting over the words. By evening, new ones had been added beneath. "Erase all you want. We don't forget. Silence." The sun shifted slightly, casting longer shadows now. A leaf blew across the lot, scraping pavement like a match never lit. Brent's hand trembled as he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out an envelope. Inside, a letter, drafted but never mailed. An apology addressed not to Isaiah, but to himself. The kind of letter that asks for redemption without admitting full guilt. He let it fall back into the pocket. Some letters were never meant to travel. Rick leaned on the truck harder, as if the metal could somehow prop up his insides. He wasn't tired. He was hollowed. Two teens rode past on bicycles, one calling out to the other, "That's where it happened," pointing toward the courthouse. The other asked to whom. The reply came without pause, to everyone who paid attention. Brent looked up once, as if the sky might offer a different version of events. But the sky, indifferent and uninterrupted, offered nothing. Rick looked down at a stain near his boot. Oil, or maybe old blood. Hard to tell. He didn't move away. The lot returned to stillness, and beneath a sky that remained unchanged, two men stood in the same place. But the world no longer turned for them. Isaiah Rivers did not leave as a victor. He left as proof. Proof that some faces, no matter how long forgotten, do not need to shout to be remembered. They just need to endure. And endure he did.